Good to see your faces this Sunday morning. My name is Stephanie, and I'll take you through some brief notes. So we had our last missional Christianity study this past Thursday, and we'll now scatter back to our regular groups for June through August. And our next gathering rhythm will be in September. So you'll see some extra copies of the study that Pastor George led us through. They're on the foyer table, so feel free to grab any. For the rest of our events and announcements, you'll find them in our weekly newsletter. That's at the QR code or on the Connect cards in the pews, and they can be dropped off at the metal boxes by the doors. Today we finish the book of 3 John. So for today's scripture reading, if you're able to stand, please stand with us as Pastor George leads us from 3 John, starting from verse 4. In our Red Pew Bibles, this is page 1026.
So let's turn our attention now to 3 John, the final section of this epistological series. Starting in verse 4, if you follow along with me. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth. Beloved, it is a faithful thing you do in all your efforts for these brothers, strangers as they are, who testified to your love before the church. You will do well to send them on their journey in a manner worthy of God, for they have gone out for the sake of the name, accepting nothing from the Gentiles. Therefore, we ought to support people like these, that we may be fellow workers for the truth. I have written something to the church, but Diotrephes, who likes to put himself first, does not acknowledge our authority. So if I come, I will bring up what he's doing, talking wicked nonsense against us. And not content with that, he refuses to welcome the brothers and also stops those who want to and puts them out of the church. Beloved, do not imitate evil, but imitate good. Whoever does good is from God. Whoever does evil has not seen God. Demetrius has received a good testimony from everyone and from the truth itself. We also add our testimony, and you know that our testimony is true. This is the word of God. You guys can have a seat. So, last week, I made mention of one of the reasons why the Apostle John was writing a letter to this guy, this individual, this person Gaius, identified in the first verse. It's interesting, again, we talked about this a little bit, but just for review, it's interesting that he's actually writing, it seems like a personal letter. This seems like a personal address to a specific person. And we know that he expected that the message in this letter would be repeated throughout the church, that it was a general encouragement, but he was also writing to a particular situation in a particular context. And I talked about why it was written in such a way, but one of the reasons that I didn't get into that we'll talk about a little bit today is that it's really, really interesting that it sounds like, in verse 9, he says, I have written something to the church, but Diotrephes, who likes to put himself first, does not acknowledge our authority. So he's having an issue with this guy Diotrephes. We're going to talk about it a little bit, but what was happening here is the suppression of John's message. The verbiage, the way that it's phrased in the original language here, it sounds like he didn't just write a quick note. He actually wrote a substantial body of text to be sent to this church, and this guy intercepted it, that he suppressed the message. And so why is he writing to this guy Gaius? Well, he still wants the church to hear the message. He still wants to address the issues that's going on. And so he's writing to a friend who might be in some way disconnected to the machinations of this guy Diotrephes, but he still wants the message to get out there, so it needs to be received by friendly hands. It's a really sad state of the church that we see here, the abuse of authority, what's going on there. But John is working against that. He's working in conjunction with the Spirit to bring the message to the people here, even though it has to circumvent this guy, Diotrephes, who's placing himself in the way. Doesn't that sound like a modern problem? As you're hearing that, it's like, man, as sad as that sounds, like that sort of thing happens in the workplace, I think, a lot of times. People, are subverting each other to try to put themselves ahead or trying to put you behind or whatever. I think it's not crazy for us to imagine this kind of scenario. It's just really sad to see this scenario being realized in the church, isn't it? That the apostle has to write a letter to try to work out these weird issues that they're having with their leader. The leadership is just toxic at this point. I guess I love the idea that the apostle takes such a pastoral level of interest, that he wants to speak. He wants to speak into the issue here. He wants to encourage the people, but he's having to work against this guy who's been actively working against him. Kind of a scary thought. Apparently, whatever was in that body of text, whatever was in that letter, theologically, God has included all that we need to know. So yeah, there's going to be mentions here and there in the New Testament, even in the Old Testament, of letters, of books that don't survive. We don't have them here. There's been some conjecture, maybe it was 2 John, maybe it was 1 John. None of those really seem like good candidates, especially because of the topics that are brought up. But it is interesting that what we have here is what God has delivered to us. And some things, like John even wrote in his gospel, Jesus did way more stuff than this, but it was too much to write down. And there's something that's beautiful about the idea that God is meeting the needs of his people at all times. And so even though this guy suppressed a letter from the apostle, this one still got through. So we see a bit of the drama behind the scenes, and it's kind of sad, but we can also read this and gain a lot of wisdom, a lot of understanding in how to deal with situations like this and ways that we can avoid falling into the same pitfalls that Diotrephes had fallen into, because I don't think he was just an evil guy, just the worst kind of guy. It seems to me that there's space for a lot of well-intending leaders to fall into really, really dark methods. And so that's what we see here, I think. So yeah, this letter kind of comes to the climax here with this big issue of Diotrephes. So yeah, everything else that John has written has kind of been working up towards this idea. But what we're seeing is the negative application of pastoral authority. And, you say, how can that be, right? How can that be? Aren't all pastors just Spirit-filled? Aren't they all just following Jesus? Aren't they all just about the business of making Jesus great, right? There's no carnal pastors, are there? And would that were true. I think it's probably a testimony for all of us to be here right now, despite the context of so much pastoral abuse throughout church history. In our country, in our state, in our area, maybe from your previous church experiences. It's one of those things that, unfortunately, leadership positions do draw narcissistic people. That doesn't mean that every single pastor is a narcissist. That does mean that most narcissists want to manage something, and a church is not an exception. So yeah, you get people in positions of authority all the time. And you probably don't even think twice about it in the workplace. You're like, yeah, people can be lame. I've had really great managers. I've had really, really lame managers, People that take credit for me, take credit for things that I do, or people that actually try to promote me. We see both, but it's just so much more insidious, I think, when it happens in the church, because there is a level of trust that the people that are looking out for you are indeed looking out for you. They're looking out for your best interests. They're looking out for the interests of the kingdom of Christ above all. That they're not seeking to build their own kingdom. And unfortunately, yeah, it's a testimony to the brokenness of humans and the sinfulness that people can still engage in, even though they're in the middle of the church. So many leaders have gone astray. And this guy, Diotrephes, is written in this record for us to examine, for the church to examine for all time and to take it as a warning. So yeah, this is an interesting time of transition in the church. We had the time of certainly of Christ himself being the authority, being the head of the church bodily on the planet. And after he ascended, after he was exalted, we have the 12. We have the apostles. Well, we had the 11, and then they elected another apostle, and then God went ahead and brought in somebody else named Paul. And we had this level of guys that were basically writing Scripture in conjunction with the Scriptures of the Old Testament and the doctrines of Christ, but they were moving forward and being the leaders, being the planters, being the people that would shape the church into something that's not only healthy theologically, but also reflective of the way that Jesus did things, the way that Jesus taught things. And so this is this strange transitionary period, as we talked about. John is the old man here. He's old. He's in his mid-80s. So most of the apostles by that time had already died. All of them martyrs. All of them died really awful deaths. But we have this transition of leadership that's happening here that by the time the 2nd century closed, you had these guys called bishops. And they were set up as overseers of regions. So at this time, and since the time of the apostles, we've had house churches, right? So they didn't have buildings in such a way. They had a city that might have a network of house churches. And so by the close of the 2nd century, you would have a bishop that's over the entire city. And all of the elders from those house churches would kind of come around this guy and seek his wisdom, seek his spiritual leadership. And, we see a lot of these early bishops were actually martyred as well. They were very, very godly, awesome guys that loved Jesus to the point of death. What we see here is this guy desiring a position exactly like that for himself. You see a guy that's working to create unilateral authority over the church, to speak for it, for its policies, certainly for its influencers. He wanted to be the absolute gatekeeper of what happened in here, and what we're seeing now is that the Apostle John himself is being gatekept. We see that this guy has set himself up to say, hey, this guy doesn't have authority over us. This guy's speaking erroneously. I'm the guy. You guys talk to me. We don't need this letter from John. You guys talk to me. So we've got this weird transition issue here. And church history can be messy. It's not all just the book of Acts and everything seems like it's going awesome. We've got serious issues here, and those serious issues are just the human condition. We're still dealing with people, broken people, people that need Jesus every moment. And this guy is no exception. He needs Jesus. And so John is writing now to deal with this guy. But I think Diotrephes stands as a permanent warning for every believer, not just people that are vying for leadership. He stands as a warning for everybody because he held this doctrine, he held this idea that it sounded good. He wants to be the protector. He wants to be the one who's making sure that the theology is good. But what has happened is that he has confused personal ambition for gospel priority, for zeal for the gospel. What's happening here is that Diotrephes is not actually fighting for Christ as God's great warrior against the Apostle John. He's actually fighting for himself, to build up his own platform, to build up his own leadership that can't be questioned. So it's interesting too that we don't read here any issues with his theology. John's not saying, hey, this guy has gone off this way or that way. Remember, he's talked about that. He's talked about the brokenness of the concept of Christ that group had in the previous book. He doesn't talk about that here. The big issue that we see here is relational. Maybe his doctrine is completely sound, but his relational abilities or his relational authority is the thing that's being abused, which brings into question his theology. Brings into question, okay, what's making this guy tick? If this is where he's going sideways, what's going on the inside that's causing this massive, massive failure? And it's interesting. We call this this would be like a failure of toxic leadership or something. It's funny, you guys have probably heard about some toxic leaders from big churches where it turns out that they were being a bully behind the scenes. They were exercising their authority in a very, very toxic way. And I wish that there weren't so many testimonies of that. When you want to get into the podcast thing and hear testimonies of that, there's plenty. But what we see here is that this idea of toxic leadership is not new. It's not new. It was going back all the way to when the Apostle John was still writing letters trying to bust some skulls because guys were taking advantage of their position. So in some ways it comforts me, but in another, it's just, for us, it's a major lesson that this is a pitfall that we can fall into, not just leaders, but Christians, the way that they approach life, the way that they approach authority, the way that they approach how they engage with other Christians. As we're going to talk about here, it really does reflect who we're serving, if we're actually serving the gospel, or maybe we're just serving ourselves. So we see here, let's see. verse 10, we actually get a glimpse of what this sinful expression of pastoral authority is. And a word on that real quick, too, because I've heard, this pastor, it wasn't a moral failure. He was just abusive with his authority. Isn't that funny? Have you guys ever thought that that's funny? Like, okay, why do we call that a moral failure when somebody is getting into, some kind of sexual impurity or something? But it's not a moral failure when he's an absolute terror, when he's an absolute jerk, an absolute menace. Like, to me, that's a moral failure. That's one of those things where, okay, you crossed the line that you shouldn't have. And so, I don't want to split hairs on what constitutes a moral failure or whatever, but anytime a pastor is abusing his authority in any way, I would view that as a moral failure, even if it's just, he's got such strong opinions that he bullies everybody and he's, kicked people out of the church because they opposed him or whatever. Like, that seems like a moral failure to me. But we don't need to split hairs on the definition. What we see here in verse 10, he says, "So if I come, I will bring up what he's doing." So he's talking wicked nonsense against us, and not content with that, he refuses to welcome the brothers. And he also stops those who want to and puts them out of the church. So previously, we had the apostle commending this guy named Gaius, right? What was he doing? You guys remember? He was welcoming the brothers. And we unpacked the brothers, what that means a little bit. Traveling missionaries, itinerant preachers. The work of the ministry was happening, or the proclamation of the gospel was happening by these guys that would travel around. They would bounce city to city, guys that had been commissioned, many of them by the apostles themselves, but they were working around the Roman Empire, teaching the Bible, teaching Jesus, evangelizing, and encouraging the church. But, and so this guy Gaius, he was commended for welcoming them in. This guy's an awesome support. All I hear is great things about the way that Gaius wants to bless and to help, and I just want to commend him for that. We see here the opposite. This guy Diotrephes is called out for refusing to welcome these missionaries. He's blocking them from coming. More than that, he's actually going so far as to cut off the people that do want to welcome him. This is ugly stuff. This is not good, and I'm sure it's all under the guise of, I want to exercise my spiritual authority to protect you. These guys are dangerous. What John is basically affirming is good guys are being sent to you, and this guy's turning them back. I'm trying to write a letter, and this guy is turning it back. So we don't see a healthy expression of authority in protection other than he's simply protecting himself. He's protecting his leadership and anybody that would be perceived as a threat to that. It's interesting, John says, I'll bring up what he's doing. And the English translation is pretty mild, what he's talking about here. What he's essentially saying is that he's forcefully confronting the situation and that he's going to get answers. He's going to get to the bottom of this and he's going to get satisfaction. So John is not saying, we'll chat over coffee. John is saying, I'm going to come over there and I'm going to get this thing done. And this guy's not going to stop the gospel. This guy's not going to stop what God is trying to do. So it's pretty forceful. We see John, stepping into his apostolic office and exercising practical discipline. Why? Okay, because it seems like we have two people that are trying to do the same thing. Right? You've got this local guy that's doing the same thing. I'm going to exercise my authority, and I'm going to protect you guys. And then we see John, I'm going to exercise my authority and protect you guys. So who's in the right here? Well, what we see is that John is not serving himself. That's the interesting thing. John is not here working to bring up his own authority. He's actually fighting on behalf of these missionaries that want to come there and on behalf of the Christians that want to stay in the church, but this guy's pushing them out. You see him working defensively for the people of God. And then you see this guy working subversively for his own benefit, for his own gain. So it's interesting because exercising discipline, exercising authority doesn't have to be an ungodly thing. I think a lot of us, have an issue with authority. Maybe some of you guys don't, and that's awesome. I don't think that we have to have a problem with authority to be like, exceptional people or whatever. But I just think based on how we're raised or based on how we respond or whatever, some people just have an inherent issue with like, this guy's saying that he's the boss, you should listen to him. Just like, Even as a Christian, you're like, yeah, I'll listen because it's godly to listen to godly advice, but still bothers me, What we see here is that he's actually operating under his apostolic authority, but he's not doing it sinfully. He's doing it protectively. He's doing it lovingly. And I think that's a good lesson for the church, that it's not sinful to exercise authority when the church is in danger, when people are in danger. Yeah, exercising authority for your own gain, that's a big problem. But what we see here is that he's fighting against hurt. He's fighting against destruction. And I think, unfortunately, when church leaders get to the point where they're just causing hurt, they're just causing destruction, when it gets to that point where the church is breaking at the seams, we see church splits happen. And by the time that happens, the fallout is so brutal. There's so much damage that's already been done. It's really, really hard for restoration to happen. People just get burned. Everybody gets burned when those situations come up. So, yeah, I think John is working to try to stop that from happening. He doesn't want this church to burn out. He doesn't want these people to just swear off of Christianity because the leadership is so toxic. I mean, how many of us would not be here anymore, if that was how we worked, if that was our ethic? I saw one bad leader, so I'm never a Christian anymore. I think we persist in knowing that Jesus is at work. He's at work through sinners, and we're hoping that those sinners that are over us in some form of leadership are crying out to Jesus daily and seeking his wisdom and seeking his goodness. They're seeking the interests of the kingdom rather than the interests of self. So, verse 11, beloved. Again, this is a direct address. He's talking to Gaius. Let's not forget that. He's writing to a guy. So he's saying, my beloved friend Gaius, do not imitate evil, but imitate good. Whoever does good is from God, and whoever does evil has not seen God. So here, John, he uses a contrast to underscore kind of the crux of the issue, the big idea. Is it wrong for an overseer, or, let's not use that word because we don't really call him that anymore. Is it wrong for a pastor to be protective over those within his care? Anybody? No, that's not wrong. Okay? Is it wrong for a pastor to exercise spiritual authority over those that are within his care? Not inherently, no. But John is speaking about the imitation of evil suddenly. So there is something going wrong here, right? Those aren't the issues. The issues aren't, he's taking on authority. That's not bad. He's taking on authority over the people that are actually under him that he should be caring for. Well, that's not inherently bad either. But John is speaking of the imitation of evil. So that means something about Diotrephes, something about the ways of Diotrephes is dragonish. There's something evil about what he's doing. There's something insidious about what he's doing. If his goals were pure and godly, then the way that he exercises authority, so let's just say maybe he does have good intentions, Maybe he really is trying to help the church and he's just confused. Well, that's a different argument, and John actually does reveal his intentions. But let's just say, for example, or play the devil's advocate here, even though the devil never needs an advocate. He's his own advocate. But let's just say that this guy was well-intending, that this is all good, it's just it's a mix-up, that's all it is it's a misunderstanding. Well, the way that he's going about all of this is insidious. The methods that he's using in his leadership smell more of sulfur and smoke than they do of the way of the Lamb. It just has this feel to it that something is really, really off here. He's not operating in this humble, loving, kind way of the Lamb, the way of Christ. In Mark chapter 10, verse 42, Jesus describes what the righteous exercise of authority actually looks like. He says this, Jesus called them together, the apostles, and said to them, "You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave to all, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." Now, I don't think that most toxic leaders would actually read that and feel the full sting of the words. Honestly, I think that they would read that and go, no, I don't lord authority and power over my people like the Romans do. No, I'm way nicer in the way that I lord power over people. They would be saying like, there's no way that they would be so evil because my intentions are good. My methods, maybe they're a little bit rough. Maybe I'm a little rough around the edges. How many you guys ever describe a leader that he's a little rough around the edges? That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's certainly making excuses for conduct. It's making room for, I can be unloving at times because that's just my way, but I really have love at the core of my heart here for you. I think Diotrephes would probably feel the same way. I think that the methods that he's engaging in, I think that he would probably say, this is for the church's health. I'm trying to help. Diotrephes basically cut off the apostle, cut off the missionaries, turned around the letter. He didn't want to receive it. Essentially he's raised the drawbridge. He's closed the portcullis on the missionaries and teachers who were friends of the apostle. And it seems like he's defending something. Maybe in his mind he's thinking he's defending the integrity of the church. But this idea that he's also rooting out those supporters in his church and showing them the door. How many of you guys want to hear the letter from the apostle? Okay, get out. How many of you guys want to bring missionaries in? Okay, get out. That's what he's doing. So that's what I mean. You could maybe try to argue, it's just a big misunderstanding, but the way that he's going about this is so insidious. The tools, the means that he's using are much more akin to the kingdom of the dragon and the way that the great dragon in this world would go about business than they are of the way that Christ goes about his business. What we're seeing here is corrupt methods, very, very worldly methods in the way that he's exercising his authority. This morning, I'm actually drawing kind of the picture, the illustration of the way of the dragon versus the way of the lamb. It comes from a book, an excellent book by a guy named Kyle Strobel and another guy named Jamin Goggin. But it's an excellent book on pastoral leadership. Specifically, it's towards leaders. But I actually think the issue here is one that relates to all Christians. All Christians in all spheres, in all circles, the way that you're engaging, the way that you're living matters just as much as the end. The whole idea of ends justifying means. No, what we're saying here is the way that you're going about your life as a Christian matters just as much as where you're going. Maybe more so, because I think it kind of reflects where you are going based on the way that you're going. So the way of the dragon, you guys might hear that, and I just, talk about the way of the dragon. That sounds so diabolical, right? It sounds so satanic, I'm not going to take on the way of the dragon. That sounds like an affront to godliness, and I love God, Maybe that's probably where Diotrephes is. I love God. I'm not trying to be like the devil here, but the way of the dragon actually expresses just the tools, the methods that can easily be adopted by Christians. Easily be adopted by Christian leaders, people who love God, seeking to accomplish kingdom goals by any means necessary. That's the issue. By any means necessary. I will get this done for Jesus by any means necessary, rather than saying, I want to do this the way that Jesus would do it. I want to do this the way that he recommends that I do that. I would go farther and say the way that he commands us to do it. No, instead of that's too loving, that's not really going to get it done, it's inefficient, it's ineffective, the better way would be the way of power, the way of strength. In a worldly interpretation of strength, and certainly in a worldly expression of power. So, the way of the dragon isn't setting up satanic rebellion, it's simply using sinful means to accomplish otherwise noble goals. We're giving this guy a massive benefit of the doubt, but again, this is a trap that we can fall into, certainly a trap that Christian leaders fall into. Diotrephes represents a leadership model that's completely substituted a lifestyle of honoring God. I don't think he realizes that. Maybe he does. I don't know how deep he is in his spirit. But essentially, He's trying to accomplish kingdom goals with worldly methods. And that's the way of the dragon. That's what we're talking about here. Even though John would go further and say that he's actually serving himself. That's, at the end of the day, he's wanting to promote himself. But we have, in this way of the dragon, what are some of those tools that we can lean towards, that Diotrephes is taking up? Well, we have the idolatry of control. The idolatry of control. See, Diotrephes' ultimate goal was to create an environment where his spiritual leadership, his spiritual authority was unquestionable. More than likely, he's thinking in his head, it's because I have the sheep on my mind. That their interests are really at the heart of how I'm exercising authority. But ultimately, what he's expressing is it's my way or the highway. I know what's best. And so to maintain that authority, he actually relied on very, very worldly control, very worldly manipulations to keep his voice the top voice in this church, rather than relying on the Spirit to be his ally, rather than walking in love, walking in these spiritual gifts that we put up every week in Galatians 5. No, he's actually just grabbing that authority and saying, you know what? I'm pulling rank here. You guys get out. Let's shut the door behind you. Theologian James Houston warns that when we rely on our own institutional leverage or our personal strengths to drive to drive a spiritual environment, we're actually practicing atheism. Strong words, right? What does that mean? Well, we're treating our own capacities as the source of power. We're treating our abilities as the ultimate source of power rather than the supernatural life of God. We're saying, ultimately, I'll reach in here and I'll take care of this. God's not moving fast enough. These are things that need to be dealt with thoroughly. I know what it needs. You don't see Diotrephes saying, hey, you know what, I'm just going to trust the Lord. And again, I'm not trying to paint this picture between like action and apathy. Where, Diotrephes is trying to get things done. It's not the way that he's trying to get things done is what's so evil here. And ultimately, there's a root to it that's evil. But yeah, so he's got this idolatry of control. He's reaching in and trying to control things, manipulating. So the next tool would be that the ends justify the means methodology. I mean, how many of you guys have seen that in our culture? Even among cultural Christians. Yeah, I don't love how it's happening, but it needs to happen. I'm not a super big fan of, all of what that looks like or all of what's being said, but it needs to happen. That's what needs to happen. I think that's, again, a level of idolatry here because Diotrephes was using manipulation tactics, right? What was he engaging in? He was suppressing the message. He was excluding the apostle and excluding the messengers. He was slandering, talking about these guys shouldn't be in the church, but he was also using intimidation. I'll push you guys out of the church if you support them, if you appeal to them. If we use the dragon's tools to protect what we think is a righteous work, we aren't defending light. We are becoming merchants of darkness. Yeah, we think what we're doing is righteous and it needs to happen. But if we're using worldly means to do it, then we are now working with tools of darkness, not working in the Spirit. Os Guinness, another famous theologian, he says this, that when the church attempts to use worldly power structures to achieve Christian goals, she mistakenly becomes her own gravedigger. It's powerful. So true. If you lose the plot, if you start applying worldly means, then you're suddenly representing the world. You're suddenly representing the dragon when people are watching how you handle business. And, you can call it anything. You call it the most righteous business ever. If they see the way that you're handling it, they will say, wow, that doesn't seem very Christian. That doesn't seem very godly. I mean, I don't know a lot about the Bible, but that does not seem okay to me. It's recognizable that it's diabolical. It's recognizable that it's self-serving. Yeah, if we besmirch the reputation of Christ on the cross, then what are we left with? What do we have? What are we representing if we can't live the way of the Lamb? We're not representing him. So this guy, Diotrephes, is actually engaging in some pretty dark stuff. Even though he's categorized as selfish by the apostle, it could be argued that he was well-intending, but the methods that he's using, much more in common with the dragon than with the way of the lamb. In verse 11, as it continues, do not imitate evil, but imitate good. Whoever does good is from God, and whoever does evil has not seen God. John is establishing a very, very strict boundary here. He's saying that the conduct is indicative. The way that you live, the way that you work, it's an indicator of the work of Christ in your life. And if you're doing evil, if you're seen doing evil, if we are perceiving the acts that are evil, no matter how noble the goals are, if you're doing that evil, then he's saying, it looks like the absence of a genuine Christian experience in your life. If you're engaging in this kind of stuff, the ways, the tools, then who is your Lord? Who is your God? It sounds like it's you. Sounds like it's your group. Sounds like it's your goals. Doesn't sound like it's Jesus, because Jesus actually cares about the way that we walk. If our daily conduct or that of our leaders is consistently unloving and evil, it calls into question our confession of Christ. It calls into question how valid that transformation is in our lives. Maybe it hasn't happened. Maybe it's just in name only, but we're certainly not operating like he asks us, like Christ would call us to operate. As John wrote in his first letter, anyone who does not love his brother, whom he has seen, cannot love God, whom he has not seen. He's just saying, if you're working in an unloving way, in an evil way, in a subversive, like in these worldly patterns, then there's a problem, and you need to slow down and examine. This is not merely, throw Diotrephes away. He's ugly, he's bad, he's dirty, he's not saved, No, this is a time for Diotrephes. If he's hearing this, he needs to examine. He needs to look in the mirror. He needs to consider, where do I need to repent? What do I need to give up and change? What patterns have I embraced? And that's the lesson for us as we're going through this. What patterns have we embraced? We need to be looking at ourselves here. And then you get verse 12. Demetrius has received a good testimony from everyone and from the truth itself. We also add our testimony, and you know that our testimony is true. So we've got this quick pivot away from Diotrephes and his fire-breathing tactics, his dragonish methods. We turn to this other guy, Demetrius, this humble and quiet affirmation of this guy, Demetrius. Just like we hear with Gaius, but this other guy in particular here, John brings up 3 witnesses. And it's interesting, as we talked about, he did this same tactic in 1 John chapter 5. And this comes kind of care of Deuteronomy chapter 19:15. A matter must be established by a testimony of 2 or 3. So John's building these 3 testimonies here towards this guy, Demetrius, who's actually commendable. He uses the testimony of community. Everybody's speaking well of him. The people that I trust see this guy and speak very, very well of him. So, this goes to show that John is hearing from people on both sides. That he's not simply deciding to dislike one guy and like the other. He's saying, hey, the people that I trust are giving me the lowdown, and this guy, he's doing good stuff. He's a known quantity by the church, and he's a spirit-filled guy. So this is, the testimony of community. Then we have John personifies the truth itself as a testimony. So he's basically saying if the gospel could speak, it would commend Demetrius. The stuff that he's doing connects with the message of Christ, connects with the work of Christ, the work of the apostles. So even if a local powerful leader, this guy, Diotrephes, he's trying to consolidate his power, but word is still getting out about spirit-filled people doing spirit-filled things. That's pretty cool. Even if the leader himself is disqualifying himself in real time, the Spirit is still working through godly people. And that's what he's saying here, that the testimony of truth itself would say that Demetrius stands with Christ and he stands with the gospel in the things that he's doing. And then finally, we have the testimony of the apostle himself. He adds his own personal weight, reminding Gaius that you can trust me because you know me And so as I'm expressing this to this guy, he's a good guy. He's a guy that you can trust. Perhaps he's connecting to possible allies. Again, we don't know, maybe Gaius lives outside of the city, so he's outside of the influence of this guy, Diotrephes. But either way, he's connecting these two guys that are godly guys. He's commending this guy to Gaius, saying, yeah, this is a good guy. I hear good things about him. This is a guy that you can trust as you're delivering this message to the church finally. So, yeah, Demetrius and Gaius would be the contrast. They would represent the way of the Lamb. They would represent the way of Christ. Not just the goals of Christ, but the methods of Christ. Yeah, in verse 11 he says, whoever does good is from God. Was Demetrius doing good? Yeah, that's what John is saying. Was Gaius doing good? Yeah, I mean, that's what John is saying here. So we have in contrast those that are doing good. We have in contrast the way of the dragon. And this guy who's working to build up his own reputation. He's using tools of image management, coercion, manipulation. You know, it's a playbook that we see throughout Scripture, but it's a playbook that we see throughout the world now. And suddenly the church there is starting to feel reminiscent of this playbook, and that's not a good thing. Yes, so the way of the Lamb. We've got the way of the dragon that, yeah, it's using all of these methods, but ultimately this guy, Diotrephes, is seeking to promote himself. And then we've got on this side the way of the Lamb. Eugene Peterson describes this concept so well. He says the way of the Lamb is essentially a path that travels along a quiet farmyard route, seeking, content with the ordinary, hidden, and heroically difficult acts of holiness that receive zero applause from the crowds. I'm going to read that one more time because it's good. It's a path that travels along a quiet farmyard route, content with the ordinary, hidden, and heroically difficult acts of holiness that receive zero applause from the crowds. Yeah, that's the holy life. That's the godly life. It's not worrying about your own reputation. I mean, we talked about this on this past Thursday night, but Jesus engaged in ministry in a way that was so unconcerned with reputation. The people that he sat with, the people that he conversed with, that he ate with, the woman at the well that he engaged with. I mean, he's constantly engaging with people that would just, it would boggle their minds. The religious leaders looking at how he's engaging in ministry, who he's engaging with. So yeah, we see somebody that's extremely concerned with how they're perceived, extremely concerned with their own reputation, their own power base. And then we see these guys that are serving others, other-centric in all that they do. Yeah, so I mean, for us, what are some of those tools that we can adopt? I mean, yeah, not all of us can lord an institution over people or over ideologies that we oppose. But, you know, in this day and age, we all have a voice, right? Everybody's voice is just as valid on social media, right? I mean, that's the crazy thing, right? Everybody can put whatever they want on there, and unfortunately, a lot of Christians go way far using tools of the dragon versus the tools of the Lamb. You know, they're looking to dunk on their opponents, looking to just see how stupid you are, see how whatever, you know, I'm going to reveal what an idiot that you are. You know, I mean, it's funny that feels, that's exactly what the devil tries to do to us. I'm going to actually reveal you for who you are, the dummy that you are, the sinner that you are. You know, the appeal of the way of the Lamb is a way towards health, towards healing, towards holiness, towards acceptance in Christ. And the way of the dragon is one of looking down on, domineering, you know, using outrage, using slander. You know, we can embrace an internal violence of spirit. And this is, you know, when I'm considering just the way that people have engaged in culture and looking at guys like John Perkins, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., you guys have heard this quote, I'm sure, but it fits so well. Something that Dr. King said, returning hate for hate multiplies hate, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. Yeah, guys, the way that we engage is just as important as where we're going. The way that we approach the people that are opposed to us, our enemies, the way that we approach them, the way that we approach the people that we disagree with. If we attempt to enforce, a righteous goal using worldly means or self-righteous promotion, manipulation, leverage, we empty the cross of all of its power. We're suddenly not a people set apart by grace. We're just slinging more stones like everybody else. The way that we engage is so important. So, yeah, as we conclude here, verses 13 to 15, I had much to write you, but I'd rather not write with pen and ink. I hope to see you soon, and we will talk face to face. The promise of that arrival. He's coming. John wants to come. He wants to be there in person. He's just kind of preparing the way. Peace be to you. The friends greet you. Greet the friends, each by name. So that personal connection with those people that are there, the friends, those people that are remaining faithful to the love of Christ, faithful to the message of the gospel, faithful to the way of the Lamb, not falling into the snare of the dragon and his tools, not falling behind the authority of this guy Diotrephes. So the way, you guys, that's the end. The way that we engage. We can't be using our fleshly strength. We can't be using the tools of the world to try to accomplish righteous goals. We have to be conducting ourselves in the same way that the Lamb of God did. Jesus held all cosmic power, all cosmic authority, and yet he came down to be a servant, and not only to serve, but to die. Using institutional coercion, using authority, using power, that's not what God did. He came down. He came down to be with us in our sin, in our brokenness. So yeah, when Jesus saved the world, and maybe this infuriates you, the way of Jesus, when he prioritized saving the world, he came down in weakness. Not just a human, but a servant. And you think well, that's not the way to rule anything. You're not going to get anything done that way. The dragon's just going to trample all over you. His people are going to eat us alive. That's true. And there's no pushback against that. That is true. That is exactly what he's calling us to do. It's so interesting because when he says, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, follow me. You guys have to remember, the cross was a device of execution. It was not something you could hit people with. It was something you could be nailed to. This is a very, very different ethic than worldly means. And that's why it's infuriating. I think that's why so many leaders reach out and try to grasp the power. They try to use the same tools, just like the devil's promising Jesus, I'll give you the whole world right now. Just grab the power. And Jesus says, not my will, but the Father's. I'll let him call the shots. I'm not going to abuse my power. I'm not going to abuse my authority. I'm going to defer to my Father. This is a very, very different playbook than the world's playbook, and it should infuriate us. We should be saying, Jesus, this is not the way to get things done. If you want to get things done, Lord, I have some ideas for you. This is a confrontational idea, guys. This is completely counterintuitive to human nature. Jesus is not calling us to apathy. He's calling us to the action of love. I want you to take up your cross. This is not just go hide. Let them do their thing. He's saying, no, I want you to confront with love. And you know what? They're going to persecute you. They're going to kill you for it. They're going to mock you. It's not going to go any way that's considered glorifying in the world's standards. But that's it. Jesus was not obeying the world's standards. He was confounding all of those people that wanted him to grab the power and use it. And that's exactly what he's calling us to walk in his way, to not make the power grab, but to defer to the Father, to allow him to vindicate us as we step out in love, as we take up those acts of love. He disarmed the principalities and powers. He put them to open shame by being nailed to the cross. He shamed the world and the world's systems by being nailed to the cross. We have to prioritize the way of Jesus, the way of truth, of gentleness, of humility, being willing to apologize when we're wrong. We have to embrace the way of love and keep his cross first and foremost. It is counterintuitive to the way that the world does anything. But it's the way that God has chosen to save the world, through humility, through weakness, through love. That's the power of God. The very power of God in this condescension of Jesus down to weakness and frailty. So, this morning as we come to the table, it's our opportunity to step off of the path of the dragon and the use of power, the use of worldly means. It's our space to honestly look at the tools that we've been engaging in, how we've been conducting ourselves in all of our spheres, all of our circles, behind the obscurity of Reddit and social media, whatever. Jesus sees us. He sees how we're conducting ourselves. The world sees us, sees how we're conducting ourselves. So this is our opportunity for us to see us and how we're conducting ourselves, to ask the Spirit to show us in this moment now. But before we take communion, as we come into that confession of the greatness of Jesus and the weakness of man, this is our opportunity to allow him to speak to us about those things that we ought to be repenting of. So yeah, let's just take a moment in the quiet of our hearts and allow him to stir up within us those things that we ought to be offering to him, that we ought to be leaving alone.